Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast, and let's keep week 27 going with today's Third Age Thursday, our time to visit the familiar and not so familiar stories of the Third Age. Now, this week, and for the rest of Series 4, we're going to be reading through the story of Cirion and Eorl from Unfinished Tales and learning about the origins of the people and nation of Rohan. Let's pick up where we left off last week with the Northmen settling in the Vales of Anduin under the leadership of Marhwini, son of Marhari. But at length, King Calimehtar, son of Narmakil II, being free from other dangers, determined to avenge the defeat of the Battle of the Plains. Messengers came to him from Marhwini, warning him that the Wainriders were plotting to raid Calenardhon over the Undeeps. But they said also that a revolt of the Northmen who had been enslaved was being prepared, and would burst into flame if the Wainriders became involved in war. Calimehtar, therefore, as soon as he could, led an army out of Ithilien, taking care that its approach should be well known to the enemy. The Wainriders came down with all the strength that they could spare, and Calimehtar gave way before them, drawing them away from their homes. At length, battle was joined upon the Dagorlad, and the result was long in doubt. But, at its height, horsemen that Calimehtar had sent over the Undeeps, left unguarded by the enemy, joined with a great Eorid, led by Marhwini, assailed the Wainriders in flank and rear. The victory of Gondor was overwhelming, though not in the event decisive. Now, the uprising that Marhwini had said would happen did in fact take place. The Wainriders' homes, storehouses, and wagon camps were burned, but most of the Northmen's slaves died in the uprising. So Marhwini had to go back to his lands in the Vales of Anduin, with the Northmen never going back to their homes on the east side of Mirkwood. Still, the text reminds us of the importance of this friendship. Nonetheless, the alliance of Calimehtar and Marhwini had not been in vain. If the strength of the Wainriders of Rhovanion had not been broken, that assault would have come sooner and in greater force, and the realm of Gondor might have been destroyed. But the greatest effect of the alliance lay far in the future which none could then foresee: the two great rides of the Rohirrim to the salvation of Gondor, the coming of Eorl to the field of Celebrant, and the horns of King Theoden upon the Pelennor, but for which the return of the king would have been in vain. The Wainriders may have lost, but they weren't done. In fact, the text says that they plotted their revenge, beyond the reach of the arms of Gondor, in lands east of the Sea of Rhûn, from which no tidings came to its kings. Their kinsfolk spread and multiplied, and they were eager for conquests and booty, and filled with hatred of Gondor, which stood in their way. But it was a long time before they did anything about it. After all, they did not know how big Gondor was growing, and they themselves were in conflict with Khand and other neighbors to their south. But as they were all enemies of Gondor as well, they eventually formed an alliance and began to prepare an attack that would come from both the north and the south. Gondor didn't know of these plans, though they were warned that the Wainriders were recovering and possibly getting new strength. Even with that little bit of knowledge, Gondor couldn't do more than just build and train their army. So when the attack came, they were prepared, but not as much as they should have been. And that's where I'll return to the text. And the text starts with the then king of Gondor, Ondaher. Ondaher was aware that his southern enemies were preparing for war, and he had the wisdom to divide his forces into a northern army and a southern. The latter was the smaller, for the danger from that quarter was held to be less. It was under the command of Eärnil, a member of the royal house, being a descendant of King Calimehtar, father of Narmakil II. His base was at Pelargir. The northern army was commanded by King Ondaher himself. This had always been the custom of Gondor, that the king, if he willed, should command his army in a major battle, provided that an heir with undisputed claim to the throne was left behind. Ondaher came of a warlike line, and was loved and esteemed by his army, and he had two sons, both of age to bear arms, Artemir the elder and Faramir, some 3 years younger. News of the oncoming of the enemy reached Pelargir on the 9th day of Cermier in the year 1944. Eärnil had already made his dispositions. He had crossed the Anduin with half his force, and leaving by design the fords of the Poros undefended, had encamped some 40 miles north in South Ithilien. King Ondaher had purposed to lead his host north through Ithilien and deploy it on the Dagorlad, a field of ill omen for the enemies of Gondor. The problem was, though, Ondaher didn't hear about the approach of the Wainriders from the north until 3 days later. By then, the enemy was near, and their own army had been moving too slowly. The vanguard hadn't even reached the Morannon yet. Now, Ondaher was leading the main force, and he had 2 wing forces behind him, which were supposed to come around and support the flanks as they exited Ithilien. They expected the attack to come from the north or northeast, as it had in the Battle of the Plains, as well as Calimehtar's victory that we read about earlier. And now back to the text. But it was not so. The Wainriders had mustered a great host by the southern shores of the inland sea of Rhûn, strengthened by men of their kinsfolk in Rhovanion and from their new allies in Khand. When all was ready, they set out for Gondor from the east, moving with all the speed they could along the line of the Ered Lithwi, where their approach was not observed until too late. So it came to pass that the head of the army of Gondor had only drawn level with the gates of Mordor, the Morannon, when a great dust, borne on a wind from the east, announced the oncoming of the enemy vanguard. This was composed not only of the war chariots of the Wainriders, but also of a force of cavalry far greater than any that had been expected. Ondaher had only time to turn and face the assault with his right flank close to the Morannon, and to send word to Minoktar, captain of the right wing behind, to cover his left flank as swiftly as he could, when the chariots and horsemen crashed into his disordered line. Of the confusion of the disaster that followed, few clear reports were ever brought to Gondor. One thing that did happen was that Ondaher and his son Artemir were killed very early on. And though the men of Gondor were eventually able to win the day thanks to the timely arrival of Eärnil after his own victory in the south, there was another cost: Ondaher's second son, Faramir. Christopher Tolkien explains. Ondaher's second son, Faramir, was ordered to remain in Minas Tirith as regent, for it was not permitted by the law that both his sons should go into battle at the same time. But Faramir did not do so. He went to the war in disguise and was slain. The writing is here almost impossible to decipher, but it seems that Faramir joined the Eotheod and was caught with a party of them as they retreated towards the Dead Marshes. The leader of the Eotheod came to their rescue, but Faramir died in his arms, and it was only when he searched his body that he found tokens that showed that he was the prince. The leader of the Eotheod then went to join Minoktar at the head of the North Road in Ithilien, who at that very moment was giving an order for a message to be taken to the prince in Minas Tirith, who was now the king. It was then that the leader of the Eotheod gave him the news that the prince had gone disguised to the battle and had been slain. Well, folks, it was after this that Arvedwi, the last king of the Northern Realm, sought to claim the crown of Gondor. He was rejected, and Eärnil was named king instead. Now, of course, it was his son Eärnur who accepted the challenge of the Witch King and was never seen again, thus ending the reign of the kings in Gondor until Aragorn's return more than 1,000 years later. Well, folks, that does it for this week's Third Age Thursday. Come back next week as we begin the Ride of Eorl. Now, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to learn how you can support the show, get an ad-free feed, join my content council, get a bonus weekly episode, and more. And join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times as I welcome a very special guest for Fandom Friday. If you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.